Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
Reports are emerging that a serious rift is widening between Prince Harry and King Charles. The tension inside the palace has been building for months, hidden behind official statements and careful silences. But what happens behind closed doors at a private royal council meeting will force everyone inside the monarchy to answer a question they have been avoiding for years. And when Sophie, a trusted confidant who understands the family better than almost anyone, finally asks that question out loud, the king will discover that his authority inside his own family is not as stable as he believed. This is the story of what really happened inside that council chamber, what Harry asked for, what Charles wanted to give him, and why a woman who had spent years watching loyalty be taken for granted finally decided that silence had protected enough damage for long enough. Keep watching, because what unfolds will reveal something profound about the cost of return, the weight of consequence, and whether a monarchy can afford mercy when mercy has been repeatedly mistaken for weakness. King Charles had entered the council room believing he could manage this. He had called the meeting because he believed the matter could still be contained. A quiet decision, a controlled compromise, something that would protect his son without breaking the family again. The Royal Council, a senior circle of trusted advisors and family members brought together to weigh the most serious institutional and personal decisions, was supposed to give the king support, not expose his hesitation. But the demand before them was too heavy to hide beneath administrative language or gentle compromise. Harry wanted limited royal protection, not a full restoration, not a complete return. Limited, that word was supposed to make it sound manageable. But limited protection meant access to selected royal spaces. It meant ceremonial recognition, the public signs that he still held a place near the heart of the monarchy. It meant the crown acknowledging that he had not been completely erased, that blood still mattered more than public wounds. To Charles, it was mercy. To William, it represented danger. To Edward, who had served quietly and loyally for years without demanding recognition, it represented pressure that he had never asked for. And to Sophie, who had watched this family navigate impossible situations for longer than most people realized, it represented something else entirely. It represented a test of whether the monarchy would finally learn to say no. The council chamber felt colder than it should have. This was not a room designed for confrontation. It was designed for order, for hierarchy, for the careful management of power inside an institution that had survived centuries precisely because it understood how to absorb pressure without visibly breaking. But pressure, once it builds in silence, finds a way to express itself eventually. Harry arrived with a kind of defiance wrapped in vulnerability. He held himself like a man who had already rehearsed every answer. He believed the family owed him something. One final act of protection after years of distance. One final sign that blood still mattered more than the public wounds he had created by speaking about the family in ways the institution had not forgiven. Charles saw his son and felt the weight of fatherhood pressing against his chest. He wanted to help him. He wanted to believe there was still a path back that did not break the family again. He wanted to give Harry this small thing and move forward. The king had spent years trying to rescue broken bonds with soft words, with delayed decisions, with private sympathy. He believed this moment could be another opportunity to do that. But that is not all. Because the real conflict was not actually about what Harry wanted. It was about who inside the monarchy still had the courage to say no. Sophie watched Harry closely from her seat in the council. She was not moved by his pain because she remembered the damage behind it. She had watched Edward's silence after old insults. She had seen William's guarded face after every fresh demand. She had witnessed Charles trying again and again to turn heartbreak into policy, to bend the institution around one man's return because that man happened to be his son. And she had been at the private Windsor dinner the night before. She had heard the words Harry spoke about Edward's loyalty, safe obedience, as if Edward's years of steady service, his quiet devotion to duty, his consistent choice to put the family first meant nothing, as if loyalty was only something worth respecting when it came loudly, when it demanded recognition, when it came attached to pain and the threat of leaving. Sophie had watched Edward go quiet when Harry said those words. She had seen him lower his eyes, not because he had nothing to say but because he had spent years choosing dignity over defense. And something shifted inside Sophie in that moment. A kind of hardness, a kind of resolve. She carried that moment with her into this council chamber. She carried Edward's quiet wound. She carried the exhaustion of watching loyalty be taken for granted by someone who treated it like something to use when it suited him and discard when it became inconvenient. William said nothing as Harry made his case. The prince sat composed, measured, completely controlled. But his silence was not comfort. His silence was judgment. William understood something that Charles was struggling to accept. One soft decision now could become a symbol that would ripple outward and weaken everything the family had rebuilt. Mercy shown without boundaries could look like fear. The future king was not looking at Harry like a brother waiting for peace. He was looking at him like a future monarch measuring damage and calculating cost. William had watched years of interviews. He had heard accusations. He had seen his family treated like a problem to be solved publicly rather than a family to be protected privately. And he understood that the monarchy could not afford to keep bending around one man's return. Charles felt the coldness in the room and tried to warm it with compassion. He genuinely wanted to help his son. But the council was not responding to his desire to help. The council was waiting to see something else entirely. It was waiting to see whether the institution would finally hold a line, or whether it would break again. Camilla watched the king carefully. The queen consort understood the danger better than anyone. She knew that mercy shown to one person without limits could weaken the palace's wider authority. She knew that the public was watching. She knew that every decision made in this room would send a message beyond the palace walls about whether the crown could protect its own boundaries. Sophie remained still in her seat. She had not spoken yet. But everyone in that room could feel her presence. Everyone understood on some level that something had changed in her. That the trusted confidant who had always worked behind the scenes to smooth difficult moments was no longer interested in smoothing this one. Harry began speaking. He outlined his request with careful precision. Limited protection meant security for himself and his immediate family. Ceremonial access meant he could appear at selected royal events without returning to full official duty. He framed it as necessary for his dignity. He framed it as necessary for his safety. He made it sound reasonable, modest, even like a man asking for very little after giving up so much. Charles listened and wanted to say yes immediately. William listened and remained silent. Edward looked down at the table. And Sophie listened and remembered a dinner that had happened the night before in a private dining room at Windsor Castle. That dinner was supposed to lower the temperature. Charles had arranged it as a family meal meant to remind everyone they were still family before they faced the council's formal process. No cameras, no press attention, no ceremony, just family sitting together, hoping that closeness might soften the coming confrontation. But one sentence had destroyed that hope. Harry had spoken casually about Edward's years of service, calling it safe obedience. The words were meant to sound light, almost teasing, but they landed with a different weight entirely. They revealed something about how Harry saw loyalty, as weakness, as fear, as the absence of courage rather than its presence. Edward had not responded. He had simply gone quiet. Sophie watched him lower his eyes and understood what was happening inside his mind. Edward had spent years choosing loyalty without fanfare. He had served without demanding recognition. He had supported the family and the institution through difficult moments without complaining or threatening to leave. And in one casual phrase, Harry had reduced all of that to something small. Sophie felt the insult move through the room like a cold blade. She watched Edward's withdrawal and made a decision. She removed her gloves slowly that night, one finger at a time, and made a private vow. She would not let Harry walk into the council room and ask for restored trust after reducing Edward's quiet sacrifice to safe obedience. Now, in the council chamber, she carried that vow with her. Harry continued making his case. He spoke of pain. He spoke of years of distance from the family. He spoke as if pain itself should be enough to warrant restoration. As if his suffering created an obligation on the monarchy to ease it, regardless of what had caused the distance in the first place. William's expression did not change. But everyone in the room understood that the future king was not convinced. The prince knew that one soft decision could become a symbol that would echo through decades. He understood the power of symbolism inside an institution built on symbolism. Charles prepared to offer his compromise. It was a carefully constructed document designed to give Harry something without giving him everything. Limited protections, ceremonial access, the kind of middle ground that felt like victory to someone desperate enough to accept it. The king believed this compromise could work. He believed it could satisfy Harry without damaging the institution. But that is not all. Because before Charles could present his compromise, Sophie moved. She pushed her chair back from the table. The scrape of that movement cut through the room like a warning. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was unmistakable. Everyone understood that something was about to shift. Sophie stood. Her movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. She looked at Harry directly. And then she asked the question that no one else had dared to ask. She asked why the monarchy should reopen its doors to someone who treated loyalty like something to use when it was convenient and discard when it became inconvenient. The question hung in the air. It was not accusatory. It was not hostile. But it was unmistakable in its directness. Sophie had not raised her voice. She did not need to. The power of the question lay in its simplicity. Harry's expression changed immediately. The defiance cracked. The rehearsed answers suddenly seemed less relevant. He leaned forward, visibly wounded, and accused Sophie of speaking from bitterness instead of understanding. He asked why she was turning his pain into something to be judged. Sophie did not flinch. She had spent years watching this family navigate impossible situations. She had watched Edward carry duty without applause. She had watched William carry pressure without escape. She had watched Charles turn family guilt into compromises that never quite worked because they were built on avoiding the hard answer rather than accepting it. This time, she refused to let emotion dress itself as justice. She refused to let pain override consequence. She refused to let the institution bend again around one man's return. Keep watching. Because what Sophie's confrontation revealed was something no one in that room had been willing to say out loud. William said nothing when Sophie finished speaking, but his silence was louder than any words could have been. The future king kept his eyes on Harry, not with hatred, but with the hard distance of a man who had already counted the cost of previous compromises. His silence gave Sophie's words weight because everyone in that room understood what William's silence meant. It meant the future king was not going to rush to rescue his brother. It meant William was not going to soften the boundary that Sophie had just drawn. It meant the next generation of the monarchy was not interested in bending around one man's pain. Harry felt that too. He turned toward Charles, expecting the king to intervene. He expected his father to stop this, to remind the council who held the authority in this room, to protect him from the trusted confidant's words. Charles raised his hand, trying to end the exchange before it broke the room completely. But the command came too late. No one moved with the speed Charles needed. No one rushed to soften Sophie's challenge. No one rushed to defend Harry. The king's intervention, when it finally came, did not settle the room. It only made the silence deeper. In that terrible pause, something shifted. Charles still wore the crown, but the emotional authority had moved. The council stopped looking to the king for guidance. It began looking to William to see where the future monarch stood. Power inside a monarchy does not always move with declarations and formal announcements. Sometimes it moves through silence. Sometimes it moves when the future king does not defend his brother. Sometimes it moves when a loyal woman finally says what the institution has been too afraid to say. William became the quiet center of gravity in that room before he said a single word. The prince understood that Harry's request was not just about one man asking to return. It was about whether the monarchy could protect its own boundaries after years of public wounds. That mattered because every royal decision sent a message beyond the palace walls. Every message could either strengthen public trust or weaken it. Charles tried to maintain control, but his hesitation had cracked his authority in public. He wanted to be both a compassionate father and a responsible monarch, but the room could feel the strain of trying to be both at once. His silence after Sophie spoke, his failed attempt to stop the confrontation, his visible struggle to know how to respond. All of it revealed something the council did not want to see. The king was divided. Sophie remained standing. She did not repeat herself. She did not need to. Her words were already working through the room like a truth that no one could ignore. Harry watched the doubt spread through the council and understood that the support he had expected was slipping away. He had believed Charles's compassion would guide the room. He had prepared himself for William's coldness. He had expected the institution to bend because his father was king and his father loved him. What he had not prepared for was the moment when his father's love would not be enough to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. William finally spoke. His voice was slow and controlled. The future king said that the monarchy could not reward damage simply because damage had become painful. The words were not angry. They were not cruel. But they landed with the weight of finality. Harry looked as if the words had struck him directly. He turned back to Charles, searching his father's face for some sign of intervention, some last act of protection that might still be possible. Charles picked up the prepared compromise note. It was the document that had taken days to construct, the carefully written promise of limited protections and ceremonial access, the king's attempt to give his son something without giving him everything. He held the paper for a moment, reading it one final time as if the words might have changed since he had last looked at them. Then Charles set it down and signed. That small action told the room everything. The compromise was dying. The king was allowing it to die. Sophie felt no triumph as the room turned against Harry's request. The trusted confidant had spoken with force, but she did not enjoy the wound her words had created. She knew pain was spreading across the table. She knew Edward felt it too. She understood that consequences were now unavoidable. Still, she believed silence would have been worse. Silence had protected too much damage for too long. Silence had allowed the institution to bend repeatedly around one man's return, asking loyal members to carry the cost of that bending without question. Harry stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with hands that tried to look steady. He looked around the room at the faces of people he had expected would welcome him back, and he asked a question that no one in that room had prepared to answer. Does anyone in this room still see me as family? The question landed harder than any anger could have. Charles looked at his son, and for a second the king seemed unable to breathe through the grief. William did not answer. The prince's silence was not cold for the sake of cruelty. It was the silence of someone who had already given too many chances to pain that kept returning as pressure. Sophie stayed still. She had forced the truth into the open, but even she could feel how heavy that truth had become. Edward finally looked up, visibly emotional. But he did not rescue Harry from the question. He had spent years choosing loyalty over attention. He had served without demanding recognition. And now his quiet pain stood as proof of what had been ignored for far too long. Charles pushed back from the table and followed his son toward a side room, leaving William and Sophie behind with the council's stunned silence. The door closed behind father and son, and in that private space without aides or titles or ceremony, they faced the wound that no council vote could repair. Away from the council table, the storm became smaller and somehow more painful. Charles and Harry stood in a room where no one could perform for history. The king no longer sounded like a monarch. Harry no longer sounded like a prince. For a few minutes, they were simply father and son, facing the terrible truth that love had survived, but trust had not. Charles looked at his son and finally said what he had avoided in front of everyone else. He wanted to help him. He wanted to believe there was still a path back that did not break the family again. But the institution could not be forced to ignore years of damage just because the wound had become personal. That mattered because the crown could forgive in private, but it could not reward pain in public without weakening its own rules. Harry listened, but every word seemed to push him farther from the comfort he had expected. He admitted he had expected resistance from William. He had prepared himself for the prince's coldness. But Sophie had wounded him differently. She had not spoken like an enemy. She had spoken like someone who had watched too much, remembered too much, and finally refused to protect him from truth. Charles placed one hand on the back of a chair, close enough to move toward his son, but not close enough to embrace him. That small distance said everything. Harry waited for comfort, but comfort did not come. The monarch had spent years trying to rescue broken bonds with soft words and private sympathy. Now he understood that leadership required something harder. He had to stop using love as a reason to avoid consequence. He had to accept that the monarchy could not keep bending every time family pain became unbearable. But that is not all. Because when Charles returned to the council chamber, the decision he announced would change everything that followed. The king's voice was steady now, but it carried the weight of a man who had made a choice he never wanted to make. He announced that no restoration would move forward without unanimous trust. Strict conditions would be established. Clear rules, written limits, consequences if those limits were broken. William heard the finality in his father's voice and understood what had just happened. The king had chosen duty over denial. The crown had finally said no and meant it. Sophie lowered her eyes. She had not wanted victory to feel like this. She had wanted the institution to protect its boundaries, but she had not anticipated how much the protection would cost everyone inside the family. By the time the decision left the palace walls, the private wound had become a national reckoning. The next morning, the story escaped with brutal force. It was no longer a quiet council dispute. It was a national drama about loyalty, power, and the cost of returning too late. The headlines dominated every screen. Sophie's stand. The day Harry was told no. The future king's judgment. Broadcasters discussed the confrontation endlessly. Commentators analyzed what it meant for the monarchy's future. The palace had produced a moment no press office could soften. Outside Buckingham Palace, people gathered. Some defended Harry as a wounded son. Others praised Sophie for saying what the family had avoided for years. The gathering mattered because it showed the country was divided in the same way the palace had been divided between sympathy for pain and respect for consequence. Camilla watched the coverage in silence. The queen consort understood why the public framing hurt Charles. It made the king look weak, even though she believed he had acted with genuine restraint. She turned off the television without comment. William did not celebrate the coverage. The prince understood that public approval could be dangerous when it made private pain look simple. But he also understood the meaning that no one could ignore anymore. The monarchy had shifted. William's generation had begun to take emotional control of the institution, not through drama or confrontation, but through the quiet strength of finally being willing to say no. Harry became the face of return denied. Sophie became the voice of boundary restored. Charles became the father who had to stop saving one son to protect the crown. And when the noise finally settled, one truth remained standing in the silence Sophie had created. The confrontation was not about cruelty. It was about limits. Sophie did not destroy Harry in that room. She forced the monarchy to stop pretending pain could erase consequence. Charles did not stop loving his son. He finally accepted that love could not govern the crown alone. Harry did not simply lose a request. He lost the illusion that return was possible without repair. The monarchy survived because someone finally said no. And the king finally allowed that no to stand. The crown chose duty over denial. And in doing so, it moved toward something stronger than mercy. It moved toward the kind of strength that comes from boundaries that actually hold. Do you think Sophie was right to confront Harry in front of the council? Or did she cross a line by forcing the family's pain into the open? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If the story stayed with you, make sure you like and subscribe. Click the video on your screen right now to watch what happens next. You will not want to miss it.